The history of Tanaris in World of Warcraft is built around the idea of unforgettable nothingness. It's a place that feels completely dead, but somehow is so alive at the same time. On the surface, this zone is easily one of the most bleak, desolate, and miserable places in all of Azeroth. In fact, if you use some questionable maths to map out the geography like I did, you find that almost 40% of this region consists of absolutely nothing. But that then leaves us with a bit of a contradiction, because packed into the remaining 60% is a dense, blood-soaked history of ancient empires, goblin capitalism, pirates, and a forgotten troll civilization that refused to die. And that is the great paradox of the Tanaris Desert. How did a wasteland filled with so much empty nothingness become one of the most iconic stops on our journey to level 60? To understand that, we have to look past the shifting sands and take a look at the history of Tanaris. When you look at Tanaris today, it's hard to imagine it as anything other than a scorched wasteland. But if we wind back the clock to Azeroth's ancient history, this place was a bit more alive. "16,000 years ago, back when Azeroth was a single supercontinent, the troll race reigned supreme. But one day their thriving civilization was shattered by a single event that was all orchestrated by the void entity known as Xal'atath, the very same villain driving the World Soul Saga today. Now I know that most of us already know the background lore behind the rise of the Troll Empires. I'm not going to deep dive into it today, as it would just be repeating lore we've already covered in different videos. So if you want the full story, the best video to check out is the one covering the history of Silithus, which will be linked in the description and pinned in the comments. The too long didn't read version is that Xal'atath convinced a Gurubashi witch doctor to wake up an ancient Cathraxi general from the Old God's Black Empire. Desperate to fulfill the Old God's prophecies of destroying Azeroth, this Cathraxi general summoned a massive ancient insectoid army known as the Aqir. He called them back to the surface, sparking the devastating Troll-Aqir War. The Gurubashi trolls fought a brutal campaign against this Aqir army all across Southern Kalimdor, and eventually they managed to push the bugs all the way back to the ancient Titan complex of Ahn'Qiraj, the place where the old god Cthulhu had been imprisoned thousands of years before.
Your courage will fail.
Once victorious, the Gurubashi tribes claimed a sort of massive jungle belt stretching all across the southern parts of Kalimdor. While most of the Gurubashi Empire settled in the east, one single tribe, the Razor Branch tribe, decided to stay right where they had just defeated the insects, near the gates of Ahn'Qiraj. Under dense jungle canopies, they built a thriving city that would eventually be called Zul'Farrak. For 6,000 years after the Troll-Aqir War, the Razor Branch trolls thrived in their jungle city. But as we all know in Warcraft lore, no king, or better said, no empire, rules forever. Now with all of that background troll lore out of the way, I think it's time for more troll lore. While the Razor Branch were expanding their empire in the jungle, a separate tribe of dark trolls had settled near the Well of Eternity. Over the same 6,000 years, the arcane energies radiating from the Well of Eternity physically transformed them into a much more familiar face, the Night Elves. Again, I won't waffle on and retell the entire War of the Ancients here, but all you need to know here is that this war between the Night Elves and of course the Burning Legion that they attracted ended with an event called the Great Sundering. The Well of Eternity imploded, sending over 80% of ancient Kalimdor straight to the bottom of the ocean, of course splitting that supercontinent into the world we recognize today. Cities disappeared, mountains were swallowed by the ocean, and crucially for our story, entire jungle regions were violently stripped of their vegetation and left to bake under an unrelenting sun. And just like that, the desert of Tanaris was formed. Luckily for the Razorbranch tribe, their city of Zul'Farrak wasn't dragged into the ocean depths, but their world had still changed overnight. Almost instantly, these trolls went from living in a jungle environment to now trying to survive in a scorching new wasteland. The Razorbranch were left with a brutal choice here: adapt to this nothingness, or die. In the years following on from the Great Sundering, the sun beat down on the survivors of Zul'Farrak. Over generations, their bodies physically changed to survive in this desert, transforming them into the sand trolls that we know today. Now calling themselves the Farraki, or the Sandfury tribe, they managed to continue on with their harsh existence within the walls of their isolated city. Despite drawing this short straw, the Sandfury managed to maintain a deep spiritual connection to the wild beasts that they worshipped. For the Farraki, their ultimate devotion was directed towards a terrifying three-headed hydra named Garzrilla. When the trolls originally built Zul'Farrak, they made sure to construct a massive sacred pool right at the absolute heart of the city. It was a dedicated space where they could perform dark rituals to appease this demigod. With the trolls now going insane from heatstroke over in Zul'Farrak, the Great Sundering had revealed something else on the other side of Tanaris. The shifting sands had revealed the location of the Bronze Dragonflight's primary base of operations, the Caverns of Time. This is the sacred sanctuary where the aspect of time Nosdormu and his flight watch over the shifting timeways. To break the fourth wall for a moment here, the lore and the history behind the Caverns of Time can get complicated, like Christopher Nolan movie level complicated, so I think it's best that we cover the entire history of the Caverns of Time in a dedicated video. So for now, let's move on from the Caverns of Time and focus our attention back towards the gates of Ahn'Qiraj. For the next 9,000 years, the Farraki trolls lived in total isolation. One by one, their smaller outposts across Tanaris were swallowed up by the relentless desert, forcing the sand trolls to pull back entirely behind the walls of Zul'Farrak. But while they hid from the world, their distant cousins, the Night Elves, were slowly expanding back out across Kalimdor. Roughly 1,000 years ago, Archdruid Fandral Staghelm launched an ambitious project to try and revitalise the neighbouring zone of Silithus. To do so, he sent his son Valstan and a group of druids down there on a reconnaissance mission. While scouting Silithus, they stumbled into the ancient Titan facility of Ahn'Qiraj, accidentally awakening the slumbering Karaji and disturbing the old god Cthulhu, who was imprisoned below. Driven into a frenzy by Cthulhu's maddening whispers, the insectoid swarms inside Ahn'Qiraj then burst from the fortress to conquer Kalimdor, starting the War of the Shifting Sands. It wasn't long before the Karaji were pushing past the borders of Tanaris and attacking the trolls of Zul'Farrak. The exact tactics the trolls used to hold off the endless swarm remain a bit of a mystery, but the city of Zul'Farrak was ultimately saved from the insectoids by the sacrifice of a high-ranking troll named Theka the Martyr. Although his mortal body fell during this war, it is said that his spirit never left the city, and his undead form continues to watch over the city today, while the insects who took him down were cursed to spend an eternity as scarabs, scurrying beneath his feet. Realizing they couldn't break through to Zul'Farrak, the Karaji then gave up and marched further east, launching a fatal mistake of an assault on the Caverns of Time. This directly dragged the Bronze Dragonflight and the other major dragonflights out of the shadows and onto the battlefield. Now allied with the Night Elves, the dragons launched a massive counter-offensive, driving the Karaji back to Ahn'Qiraj and sealing them inside, behind the famous Scarab Wall. While a few scattered pockets of these insectoid forces did remain in the desert, they didn't really pose much of a threat, and as a result, a strange quiet then fell over Tanaris for the next 900 years. The sand trolls kept themselves to themselves, and the dragons quietly guarded the timeways. But as the more modern era of Warcraft history approached, an evil force was marching towards Tanaris, hunting for their buried god. Our story picks back up in the 10th year following the opening of the Dark Portal and the initial Orcish invasion of Azeroth. An important figure during these events was the infamous ogre mage and chieftain of the Twilight's Hammer clan, Cho'gall. Towards the end of the Second War, the leader of the Orcish horde, Gul'dan, had been torn to shreds by demons during his reckless quest to uncover the hidden tomb of Sargeras. Cho'gall and the remnants of his clan managed to survive the fallout of this mission and then abandoned both the Horde and the Burning Legion, later sailing west across the Great Sea towards the mysterious continent of Kalimdor, hopelessly drawn in by the dark whispers of the Old Gods. But unbeknownst to them, they weren't alone. They were being tracked by Garona Halfhasen, the half-orc, half-Draenei assassin who had removed herself from the Horde. Garona was deeply determined to hunt down and eliminate the last surviving members of the Shadow Council. Driven by a fanatical desire to liberate the Old Gods, resurrect the Black Empire, and trigger the cataclysmic end of the world, Cho'gall spent months searching for Cthulhu. Eventually, the Ogre Mage and his cultists established a hidden base within the cave networks twisting beneath the deserts of Tanaris, sensing that this place was incredibly close to the prison of Cthulhu in Arcurage. But it wasn't long before his followers started mysteriously vanishing one by one. Garona had caught up to them, and she was taking out his cultists from the shadows. Cho'gall and his remaining disciples fled into the desert night, heading towards the gates of Arcurage. But just as the Twilight's hammer vanished into the shifting sands, a completely different ancient race was making its way across the globe towards the desert wasteland. After breaking free from their enslavement by the Zandalari trolls, the goblins of Azeroth spent 100 years liberating their home island of Karazhan and building their own civilization. Driven by a deep love for gold and pretty much anything shiny, they left their home island and scattered across Azeroth to set up their own trading towns and economic trade routes. One of their earliest and most famous outposts was of course Booty Bay down in the Stranglethorn Vale. But it wasn't long before these goblins pushed their boundaries so far that some of them ended up in the deserts of Tanaris. The Steamwheedle cartel, led by the trade prince Marin Noggenfogger, arrived in Tanaris a few years after the end of the Second War between the Orcs and the humans. It's hard to say what the goblins saw in this empty desert, but they certainly saw something. Yep. I assume it's probably to do with the fact that it's Kalimdor's closest point to Booty Bay back on the Eastern Kingdoms. But anyway, they decided to settle in Tanaris, and they quickly founded the Goblin city of Gadgetzan. Over the next few years, this settlement grew into the capital city for the Steamwheedle cartel. It became a hub where the top engineers, alchemists, and merchants from all over Goblin kind gathered to trade and strike shady deals. As the town continued to expand, it would eventually be able to offer anything a traveller could possibly need, including banks, auction houses, vendors, and even a small arena right in the centre hosting bloodsport events for entertainment. Gadgetzan quickly became the main attraction in Tanaris, especially when the first waves of us adventurers arrived in the 25th year on the Warcraft timeline. When the first lot of us adventurers finally arrived in Gadgetzan, there were a handful of critical assignments waiting on the bulletin boards and plenty of locals ready to pay us handsomely for doing their dirty work across the region. First up was working for the Gadgetzan Waterworks Company. Of course, water is always going to be the most valuable commodity in a desert wasteland, and their vital water wells were caught in a two-front war, facing relentless raids from the local Waste Wander nomads and a rapidly growing infestation of silithid insectoids burrowing up from beneath the sands. Beyond securing the water supply for Gadgetzan, we also lent a hand to the Baron, Marin Noggenfogger, helping him collect the ingredients for what would become the world-famous Noggenfogger elixir. One famous quest in this zone even involved escorting a hopelessly slow turtle called Tuga back home to his turtle wife in time for dinner, a journey that felt like it took an absolute eternity across the Bacon Sands of Tanaris. Given its strategic geographical location on the southern tip of Kalimdor, the coast of Tanaris also made for an ideal pirate haven. The South Sea freebooters had already established a strong foothold further north along the merchant coast in the Barrens, where they had been causing relentless headaches for the goblins of Ratchet. Riding the wave of their success in the Barrens, excuse the pun, these pirates began expanding down the continent's southern shores, eventually setting up two major operations right on the beaches of Tanaris. They set up camp in Lost Rigger Cove and an outpost along the Southbreak shore, severely disrupting the vital goblin trade routes running between Steamwheedle Port and Booty Bay. Naturally, the goblins weren't going to take this financial hit lying down, and we were hired to march down to their beach camps and aggressively remind them who was in charge. After that, our journey across Tanaris took us further south to investigate the massive, locked Titan gates leading into the fabled region of Uldum. Not much was going on down there at this point in time, but it was certainly still a place worth exploring. In Gadgetzan, we were also tasked with keeping the local ecosystem in check by hunting down the aggressive populations of desert basilisks, hyenas, and scorpids that were constantly harassing the cartel's trade routes. But handling the local wildlife, dealing with the pirates, or protecting the water supply was nothing compared to the true shadow looming over the region of Tanaris. Inside Gadgetzan, rumours had begun circulating about the isolated ancient city of Zul'Farrak. Stories of a mysterious, terrifying blade known as Sul'Thraze the Lasher were being spread. Apparently it was a weapon so powerful it could strike absolute dread and weakness into anyone. Apparently the blade had been shattered into two halves, and both of those pieces were still hidden somewhere inside Zul'Farrak. There were also grim reports that a band of mercenaries and some explorers who had briefly passed through Gadgetzan had mistakenly wandered straight into the city and never returned. Worse still, there were rumours of something sleeping beneath a sacred pool at the dead centre of the city, a colossal ancient demigod capable of unleashing absolute devastation on anyone foolish enough to disturb it. With so many unanswered questions, rumours, and the threat of the Sandfury tribe growing by the day, it was time for us adventurers to breach the gates, put a stop to the rising troll threat, and finally uncover some of the truth about what was going on inside Zul'Farrak. After splitting off into 5-person groups, squads from both the Horde and the Alliance packed up their gear, left the relative safety of Gadgetzan, and marched west into the dunes. The siege of Zul'Farrak kicked off with an attack on Antusol, the tribe's lethal basilisk master, closely followed by a confrontation with the revered spirit, Theka the Martyr. Striking these two down early on dealt a massive blow for the Sandfury's defences. From there we pushed further into the city to eliminate the cruel witch doctor, Zumra, before finally arriving at the towering steps of the main temple. After climbing to the very top, we found some of the missing people we were looking for. We then broke open the gates and released the trapped mercenaries, the travellers, and the goblin prisoners. But this jailbreak triggered absolute chaos down below us. A sprawling, angry army of Sandfury trolls gathered below to cut off our escape. We then had to hold our line on the temple stairs, fighting off wave after wave of desert trolls before ultimately striking down the mob's leaders, Necrum and Seziz. With the temple steps now clear, only one major target remained inside of Zul'Farrak, Chief Sandscalp. This fanatical leader was completely obsessed with restoring the Sandfury tribe to its former glory, posing a massive threat to the goblins of Gadgetzan. Luckily, one of our rescued prisoners, a goblin engineer named Weegly Blastfuse, managed to blow open the heavy gates leading straight to the chief's private quarters before making his own frantic escape from the city. We marched into the inner sanctum of Zul'Farrak, confronted the Sandfury leader, and after a fierce, brutal battle, we took out Chief Sandscalp. But just as we turned to leave Zul'Farrak, a violent rumble rippled through the stone beneath our feet. It was coming from the sacred pool at the centre of the city. After cutting through the hydromancer guarding the waters, we realised we finally held the key to uncovering the city's darkest secret. Using the ancient Mallet of Zul'Farrak, which was an artifact obtained through a completely separate, grueling journey across the world in the hinterlands. Fortunately for us, someone in our group had the foresight to bring it along. We used it to strike the massive gong at the sacred pools of Zul'Farrak, and the waters beneath it began to swirl, and all of a sudden, the legendary three-headed Hydra, Garzrilla, burst out of the pool. Following a long battle, the massive beast was finally brought down, putting an end to the Sandfury troll threat and casting a sudden, eerie silence over the ancient city. With our business in Gadgetzan wrapped up and the ruins of Zul'Farrak thoroughly cleared out, we packed up our gear and then continued our journeys across the rest of Azeroth. A few months later, Gadgetzan would go on to prove its worth as an absolutely vital staging ground during the later stages of the Alliance and the Horde War in Argyrash. Champions from every corner of Azeroth used the neutral Goblin City as one of the final outposts to rest, restock, and rally their forces before marching west into Silithus to finally confront the old god, Cthulhu. 3 years after the fall of Cthulhu inside the ruins of Argyrash, the dark influence of the old gods began to rise up yet again. but this time it was being channeled through the corrupted black dragon aspect, Deathwing the Destroyer. From deep within his underground lair in Deepholm, Deathwing began absorbing massive amounts of elemental energy from the world itself. This reckless consumption completely destabilized the elemental plane across the world, causing the elements themselves to violently lash out across the surface of Azeroth in a wave of global chaos and destruction. During this widespread elemental unrest, the sister of the Sandfury Hydromancer we had eliminated in Zul'Farrak a few years ago suddenly appeared near the city's sacred waters, attempting to resurrect the fallen Garzrilla. Word of this dark ritual quickly reached both the Horde and the Alliance, and we were called back to the gates of Zul'Farrak for a second time to settle some unfinished business. We fought our way back inside, cut down the new Hydromancer, and put the Hydra back in the ground for the final time. But this period of unrest wasn't quite over. Once his strength was fully restored, Deathwing burst out of Deepholm and ripped across the face of the planet, triggering the world-shattering event known as the Cataclysm. Landscapes were torn to pieces, entire cities were swallowed by fire, and coastlines were instantly flooded as the oceans reclaimed the land. The neighbouring region of Thousand Needles, a canyon of dry salt flats that hadn't seen water in nearly 10,000 years, was completely flooded overnight. As the waters surged inland, the sea rushed directly towards the gates of Gadgetzan. Fortunately for the goblins, the water surge stopped just outside their doorstep. While the rising tides caused by the Cataclysm did give Tanaris a new coastline, it also came at a devastating cost for the goblins. Just outside Gadgetzan's walls, the Cartel's primary shipping hub, Steamwheedle port, was completely swallowed by the ocean. Sensing blood in the water, the goblins' absolute arch-nemesis saw the perfect opportunity to strike. The South Sea pirates viewed the chaos of the Cataclysm as an open invitation to seize what little remained of Steamwheedle port. They sailed in and quickly dropped anchor on top of the sunken goblin settlement, and from here they would begin launching relentless raids against the goblin cartel that continue to this very day. Simultaneously, the shifting sands parted by the Cataclysm exposed a long hidden passage to the mysterious land of Uldum. For the first time in millennia, the ancient desert gates were revealed and opened, allowing us adventurers to safely cross the border and uncover its forgotten Titan history for ourselves. Once the initial chaos of the Cataclysm had settled down, and the floodwaters found their new shores, the remaining desert of Tanaris drifted right back to doing what it does best: existing as a dry, empty wasteland. Our journey through this desert comes to an end. But of course there is still one missing piece to this Tanaris history puzzle: the Caverns of Time. Hidden underneath the sands of Tanaris is a network of caves that holds the history of everything that ever was and everything that ever will be in World of Warcraft. And it really is as complicated as it sounds, so for that reason we will be covering it in a dedicated video. If the Caverns of Time video hasn't dropped just yet, I'll leave a link to our Silithus video instead, so you can find out more info on some of the stories we talked about today.